The sun was high in the sky, casting golden rays over the quiet suburban streets of Oak Ridge Heights, a small neighborhood in Indiana. 11-year-old Kiara Daniels stood proudly behind her homemade lemonade stand, her smile as bright as the colorful sign she had carefully painted the night before. The letters read, "Kiara's Famous Lemonade, 50 cents a cup," with little hearts and lemons drawn around the edges. Kiara's stand was set up right outside her family's modest home. A cozy one-story house with a neatly trimmed lawn and a big oak tree that offered some shade. She had been up since dawn, squeezing lemons, measuring sugar, and perfecting her recipe. Her mother, Tasha, had supervised, of course, but this was Kiara's project, her way of earning enough money to join her class on a special field trip to the Indianapolis Zoo. As Kiara stirred the lemonade in a big glass pitcher, a soft breeze carried the tangy citrus aroma down the street. She waved eagerly at neighbors passing by. Mrs. Andrews from next door was her first customer, handing over 2 quarters with a kind smile. "This is delicious, Kiara," she said, sipping from her paper cup. "You're going to sell out in no time." "Thanks, Mrs. Andrews!" Kiara beamed, feeling a surge of confidence. Cars rolled slowly by, some honking in support as drivers waved. A few people stopped to buy a cup, and Kiara's tip jar began to fill with small bills and coins. She couldn't help but feel proud of herself. Across the street, a group of kids played basketball in a driveway, occasionally glancing over at Kiara's stand. One of them, a boy about her age, finally jogged over and handed her $1. "I'll take 2, he said, flashing a grin. "Coming right up," Kiara replied, pouring the lemonade carefully. By early afternoon, her cheeks were rosy from the sun, and her little notebook showed she had already made 15, well on her way to her goal of $50. Tasha came out to check on her, bringing a wide-brimmed hat to shield her daughter from the heat. "You're doing amazing, baby," Tasha said, her voice full of pride. Kiara grinned up at her mom. "Thanks, Mom. I think I'm getting better at pitching to customers, too." But just as she handed out another cup of lemonade, the distant sound of motorcycles rumbled in the air. It started faint, like a low vibration, but quickly grew louder and closer. Kiara squinted down the street, shading her eyes with her hand. Around the corner came a group of motorcycles, their chrome glinting in the sunlight. There were at least 8 of them, each rider clad in black leather jackets and dark helmets. The sound of their engines filled the neighborhood, and one by one, the bikes rolled to a stop right in front of Kiara's lemonade stand. The chatter of the basketball game ceased, and even Mrs. Andrews peeked through her curtains. Kiara's heart raced. The bikers cut their engines, and the street fell silent, except for the soft clink of ice in her pitcher. Kiara gripped the edge of her stand, her eyes wide, as the largest biker swung his leg off his motorcycle. His jacket had patches she couldn't read, and his beard was thick and gray. He lifted his helmet, revealing a face weathered but kind, though his expression was unreadable. "Is this where I can get the best lemonade in town?" he asked, his deep voice rumbling like the motorcycles. Kiara swallowed hard but managed a small, nervous smile. "Yes, sir, 50 cents a cup." The man chuckled, pulling a crumpled $1 from his pocket. "Make it 2." The moment felt frozen in time, and Kiara could only guess what was about to happen next. The air felt thick with tension as the other bikers dismounted their motorcycles, one by one. Their heavy boots thudded against the pavement, and their leather jackets bore intricate designs, skulls, flames, and names Kiara didn't recognize. The leader, still standing in front of her, handed her the crumpled $1 with a surprisingly gentle touch. Kiara's fingers trembled slightly as she poured the lemonade into 2 paper cups. She tried her best to keep a smile on her face, though her mind raced with thoughts. Who were these people? Why had they stopped here? The leader took a sip, letting the cool drink linger on his tongue before nodding in approval. "Not bad, kid," he said, his voice breaking the heavy silence. "What's your name?" "Kiara," she said softly, glancing at her mother, who was watching nervously from the front porch. "Well, Kiara, I think you've got yourself a new customer base," the man said with a grin, holding up his cup for the others to see. "Best lemonade I've had in years." One of the other bikers, a tall woman with long braided hair and a jacket that read Sherry, stepped forward and dropped a $5 bill on the counter. "I'll take 10 cups for the crew," she said, her voice warm but commanding. Kiara blinked. "To 10 cups?" she stammered, grabbing her extra cups and pouring quickly. As the rest of the bikers gathered around, the mood began to shift. The initial uneasiness melted into something almost festive. They started joking with one another, complimenting Kiara's stand, and even pulling out their wallets to tip her generously. "Do you make this yourself?" another biker asked, his thick southern drawl making Kiara smile a little. "Yes, sir," she replied. "My mom helped, but it's my recipe." "Kid's got talent," he said, handing her a $20 bill for his 2 cups. The bikers began sharing stories, laughing loudly, and clinking their lemonade cups like they were at a barbecue. Kiara couldn't help but relax, their kindness and humor washing away her initial fear. One of the younger bikers, who looked barely older than 20, crouched down to her level. "What's the lemonade fund for anyway?" he asked with genuine curiosity. Kiara hesitated for a moment, then answered, "I'm saving up for a school trip to the zoo." The group collectively awed, and Sherry shook her head with a laugh. "Well, we can't just leave you hanging, can we?" Before Kiara could process what was happening, the bikers began passing around a helmet, dropping cash into it like it was a collection plate. The clinking sound of coins and the crinkle of bills filled the air, and Kiara's eyes grew wide. "Here, sweetheart," Sherry said, handing the helmet back to Kiara. "That should cover more than just a zoo trip." Kiara peeked inside and gasped. There had to be over $200 in there, far more than she ever imagined earning in one day. Thank you so much," she exclaimed, her voice trembling with excitement and gratitude. "You earned it, kid," the leader said, finishing his lemonade. "Hard work deserves support." Just as the moment seemed to settle, one of the bikers, a burly man with a tattoo of an eagle on his arm, grew quiet. His gaze softened as he looked at Kiara, his rough exterior suddenly giving way to something deeply emotional. "You remind me of my daughter," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The group fell silent, their playful energy replaced by somber respect. Kiara tilted her head. "Your daughter?" The man nodded slowly. "She passed away a few years ago. She was about your age. Loved running little stands just like this. Seeing you out here, well, it's like seeing a piece of her again." The prosecutor rose for her final argument, turning to the jury with a voice steady and powerful. "This case is not just about Seth Daniel," she said. "It's about a pattern we've seen too often in our justice system. It's about officers like Vincent, who see a young black man in a neighborhood and assume he must be up to no good. It's about how this assumption leads to wrongful arrests, to humiliation, to injustice. And it's time to say, enough." The courtroom was silent as Sarah Jane's words sank in. Leah could feel the shift in the room. The jury was listening. They understood. When the trial finally came to a close, Leah dismissed the courtroom for the day. But she remained seated for a moment longer, her mind racing. She had done her job, presided over the case fairly, but the encounter outside the courthouse still gnawed at her. It was a stark reminder that no matter her position or accomplishments, she would always be seen through the lens of her race. Suddenly, the door to the courtroom opened, and Sergeant Michael Harris, the older officer who had intervened earlier, walked in. He approached the bench quietly, his face lined with concern. "Judge Ada," he said softly, "can I have a word?" Leah looked up, surprised. "Of course." Harris sighed, glancing around to make sure they were alone. "I wanted to talk to you about what happened earlier with Wilkins. He's not a bad kid, you know, but he's got blind spots, like a lot of them do." Leah met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Blind spots?" she repeated, her voice tinged with bitterness. "You mean racism?" Harris winced but didn't argue. "Maybe, probably, but I want you to know. I'm trying to fix it from the inside." Leah studied him for a long moment. She wanted to believe him, to believe that real change was possible. but after everything she had seen and experienced, it was hard to hold on to that hope. "What do you suggest I do?" she asked quietly. "When I'm sitting up here day after day, hearing cases like this, knowing what I've experienced firsthand?" Harris was silent for a long time before finally answering. "You keep doing what you're doing, Judge. You keep holding people accountable. That's the only way things are going to change." Leah nodded slowly, though the weight of the responsibility still pressed heavily on her shoulders. The trial wasn't over yet, and there would be more battles to fight. But for today, at least, she had taken a step forward. As Harris left the room, Leah glanced around the empty courtroom. She knew the fight was far from over. But today, justice had been served, and that, she thought, was a start. The following morning, the air inside the courthouse was thick with anticipation. The jury had been deliberating all night, and today would bring their decision. Leah Ada sat in her chambers, trying to center herself for what would undoubtedly be a pivotal moment, not just in this case, but for many who had been watching closely. This trial was bigger than one man's wrongful arrest. It was about the fabric of justice and the biases sewn into it. Leah sipped her coffee, staring at the files spread across her desk. Outside, she could hear the muffled sounds of reporters and protesters gathering in front of the courthouse. This was more than a local story now. News outlets across the country had picked it up, and it had become a symbol for the systemic racism still plaguing law enforcement. Her mind wandered to the events of the previous day. Vincent, the officer who had profiled her, had sat in that courtroom clearly shaken, realizing his testimony could tear apart the very system he was part of. For all the courtroom's weighty silence, Leah had heard the subtle cracks in his voice, seen the tension in his face. Bill wasn't an outlier. He was a product of a flawed institution, and Leah knew this case was about more than just making an example of one officer. It was about pushing a conversation that America had been avoiding for too long. She had a duty to deliver justice in this one case, but the weight of that responsibility was crushing. There was a knock on the door, snapping her back to reality. "Come in," Leah said, her voice steadier than she felt. Her clerk, Ophelia, entered, holding a folder. "The jury's ready," she said softly. Leah nodded, rising from her chair. She took a deep breath, smoothing her robe. "Let's do this." As she made her way to the courtroom, the sound of her footsteps echoed through the hallway. The courthouse felt different today. The tension wasn't just in the courtroom anymore. It was everywhere. Leah could feel it pressing in from all sides, an unspoken anxiety that everyone was carrying. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was stifling. Reporters filled the gallery, their pens poised, cameras ready. The families of both Seth Daniel and Officer Wilkins were seated in the front rows, both groups tense and waiting. Leah took her place at the bench, glancing briefly at Seth Daniel, who sat with his lawyer at the defense table. His face was somber, but there was a glint of hope in his eyes, a hope that justice would be served, that this trial might actually mean something. She shifted her gaze to Vincent. He looked far less sure of himself than the day before. His eyes darted nervously around the room, and for the first time since the trial began, he seemed small, like a man who had finally realized he couldn't outrun what he had done. Leah cleared her throat. "Please bring in the jury," she said, her voice echoing in the quiet room. The doors opened, and the 12 jurors filed in. Leah watched them carefully as they took their seats, trying to read their expressions, but their faces were unreadable, their eyes fixed straight ahead. The jury foreman, a middle-aged woman with dark hair pulled back into a tight bun, held a slip of paper in her hand, clutching it like a lifeline. Leah nodded toward her. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman stood, her hands shaking slightly as she unfolded the piece of paper. "We have, Your Honor," she said, her voice trembling just enough to betray the gravity of the moment. "Please read the verdict," Leah instructed, her own heart pounding in her chest, though she kept her face composed. The foreman glanced down at the paper before looking up again, her voice firming. "In the case of Officer Vincent, we the jury find the defendant guilty of wrongful arrest and racial discrimination." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Leah glanced at Seth Daniel, who sat frozen, his face blank for a moment before relief began to wash over him. His lawyer patted him on the back, and Kevin's eyes began to glisten, though he blinked away the tears. Leah then turned her gaze toward Vincent. He was staring straight ahead, his face pale, his hands clenched tightly together. The weight of the verdict had clearly hit him, and for a moment, it seemed as if he might break. She banged her gavel once. Court is adjourned. But as the room began to stir, with reporters scrambling for the exits and people filing out, Bill suddenly stood. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cracking. Leah paused, looking down at him. The courtroom quieted again, all eyes turning to the young officer. He was visibly shaking now, his face pale as he struggled to find the words. I need to say..." He swallowed hard, and his gaze fell to the floor. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting the community. But I was wrong." His voice wavered, thick with emotion. "I see now that I let my assumptions, my prejudices, cloud my judgment, and I'm sorry." The silence in the room was deafening. Leah felt her breath catch in her throat. It was an apology, yes, but it wasn't enough. It couldn't undo what had been done. She thought about all the time she had been in Kevin's shoes, stopped for nothing more than being black, and she knew this apology, though sincere, wouldn't erase those experiences. She met his eyes, her voice steady but firm. "Your apology is noted, Officer Wilkins, but the harm caused by your actions, by actions like yours, runs deep. It affects lives, families, and entire communities. Saying sorry doesn't fix that." Bill nodded, looking defeated. He didn't try to argue, didn't try to explain any further. He simply stood there, accepting the consequences of his actions. And for the first time, Leah saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes. The courtroom slowly began to empty, and Leah remained seated for a moment, watching as Seth Daniel hugged his family, his face a mix of relief and exhaustion. Vincent stood quietly by the exit, waiting to be escorted out, the weight of his guilt heavy on his shoulders. Leah's mind was racing. She had done her job, upheld the law, and presided fairly over this case, but it wasn't enough. This trial was just one drop in a much larger ocean of injustice. For every Seth Daniel who received a semblance of justice, there were countless others whose stories would never be heard, whose cases would never make it to a courtroom. Suddenly, the door to the courtroom opened again, and Sergeant Michael Harris walked in. Leah looked up, surprised to see him. He approached her quietly, his face a mix of concern and something else, something like hope. "Judge Ada," he said softly, "can I have a word?" Leah nodded, gesturing for him to sit. "Of course." Harris sat down, folding his hands in front of him. "I just wanted to say thank you," he began. Leah raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For handling this case the way you did," Harris replied. "For holding us accountable. We need that. The system needs that." Leah let out a long breath, leaning back in her chair. "I appreciate that, Sergeant, but it doesn't feel like enough. This was just one case. There are so many more out there. So many people who don't get justice." Harris nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're right, but that's why we have to keep pushing. It's not going to change overnight, but every step matters. Every case like this chips away at the bigger problem." Leah was silent for a moment, thinking about his words. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that change was possible. But after everything she had seen, it was hard to keep that hope alive. "What about Wilkins?" she asked quietly. "What happens to officers like him, ones who've been taught to think a certain way?" Harris sighed. "I'm not going to lie, it's hard. There are a lot of guys like him, but there are also people like me, trying to change things from the inside, and I'll keep doing that as long as I can." Leah looked at him, seeing the weariness in his eyes, but also the determination. It was the same determination she felt, despite the setbacks, despite the frustrations. "You keep doing what you're doing, Judge," Harris said. "That's how we change this, piece by piece." Leah nodded slowly. "Piece by piece," she echoed. As Harris left the room, Leah sat back in her chair, staring at the empty courtroom. The fight wasn't over. It never would be, But today, they had taken one step forward. And that, she thought, was how change began. As the courtroom emptied and the echoes of the verdict still lingered in the air, Leah Ada remained seated at the bench, her mind buzzing with the weight of what had just transpired. But it wasn't a victory she could savor. The trial was over, but its impact had just begun. For Leah, the fight for justice wasn't confined to this room. It stretched far beyond these walls, into communities still grappling with the same issues that brought Seth Daniel here in the first place. She stood up, gathering her files, when a voice interrupted her thoughts. It was Seth Daniel approaching her with his attorney. His face was calm now, though the tension from the last few days had clearly worn him down. "Judge Ada," Kevin said, his voice low but steady, "I just wanted to say thank you for everything." Leah looked at him, pausing for a moment before responding. "You don't need to thank me, Kevin. I was just doing my job." Kevin shook his head. "No, it's more than that. This trial, it wasn't just about me. It was about showing people what really happens out there, what we go through. You gave me a voice." Leah's chest tightened. She understood what he meant, and she nodded. "I hope this is a step toward change," she said, her words carefully chosen. "But it's just one case. We still have a long way to go." Kevin's eyes softened with understanding. "I know, but it's a start. And for that, I'm grateful." Leah watched him leave, his attorney close behind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that there was so much more left to be done. One trial, one verdict wasn't enough to dismantle a system that had been built over centuries, but she knew Kevin was right. It was a start. She sighed and began to make her way to her chambers, her footsteps slow and deliberate. The media had already swarmed the front entrance, so she opted to exit through the side door, again hoping to avoid the cameras and microphones that would inevitably be thrust in her face. But as soon as she pushed open the door, Leah found herself face to face with Officer Vincent. He was standing by the side of the building, leaning against the wall, his face drawn and pale. His uniform seemed too big for him now, as if the weight of the trial had shrunk him down. Leah stopped in her tracks, her heart thudding in her chest. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension between them was palpable, a mixture of guilt, anger, and confusion hanging in the air. "Judge Ada," Bill began, his voice hoarse. He straightened up, his eyes locking onto hers. I didn't expect to see you here." Leah remained silent, waiting for him to continue. She didn't know what he could possibly say that would change anything, but she allowed him the moment. "I've been thinking," Bill said slowly, his words heavy, "about everything, about what happened in there and about what I did to you." He paused, his hands fidgeting at his sides. "I know saying sorry isn't enough. It won't fix what I did. But I need you to know, I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Leah's eyes narrowed. She had heard this before. She had heard variations of this apology countless times. "You didn't mean for it to happen," she repeated, her voice cold. "But it did happen, Officer Wilkins, and it keeps happening. To people like Kevin. To people like me. So forgive me if I'm not moved by your remorse right now." Bill winced, but he didn't back down. "I know I screwed up. I know I let my biases take over. And I'm trying to understand that now, but it's not as simple as just unlearning everything overnight. I've been taught to see things a certain way, and I didn't question it until now." Leah crossed her arms, her face still stern. "And what changed now? The fact that you got caught, or the fact that someone finally called you out on it?"